We're good. Good evening, everyone. My name is Christy Kokiki. I'm the Head of Audience and Experience at the History Trust of South Australia, and I have the privilege of emceeing this event that we're all at here tonight. Especially tonight, but always at the History Trust. We can't conceptualise the history of South Australia that doesn't start with the Aboriginal people of this place and doesn't think about history and time differently. So I'm pleased to welcome tonight Senior Kaurna man, probably a man who needs very little introduction, as he's been generously sharing his knowledge and wisdom with us for many, many years. But it's my pleasure now to invite Mickey O'Brien, Senior Kaurna man Mickey O'Brien, to the stage to welcome you all to country.
Nature, thanks for that, Christy. The money? Oh, you asleep? Need waking up? Let's wake you up. Tuwila Manibudnik. Tuwila Wakanapadnik. Nagana Biko, Manklankla, Marwachanga Ganamina. Munarai na Wangadi Mani Budni Ganiatana, Irindi Yata, Bukiana, Warandi, Nainari, Kamatbi, Maracha. It is wonderful that when we come to a place that we can call upon the ancestors to bring you good blessings, to send away that sad or the old that follows, but to know that when we come to a place, it is to share and connect to a place, to know that this is the dreaming place of the red kangaroo. And tonight you have come to this wonderful gathering of talking about history. Oddly enough, history in our terms is ancient history, because history is classed obviously on the written history of 5,500 years old. But when you understand that as an ambassador and a descendant, that knowledge is not owned, knowledge is carried and it is shared and it is passed on. And my father, Yerla Burker, the old man of the sea, has been doing that and still does that today at 93. But when our people welcome people, we do value the people that come, because we say you are important because of the knowledge and the wisdom that you bring with you. These things are exchangeable. They're not owned by one but shared by all. And when we understand that perspective, we can have a greater sense of harmony, a greater sense of connection. I suppose tonight you're talking about collectibles, and you could probably see that I'm a walking collectible museum, I suppose. This cloak that I wear is my father's. I wear it because he has passed it. Well, did he pass it? Did I take it? I don't know. One of those two things. But anyway, I wear it in honour, and it has history. It has life. It obviously had life as an animal. Now it brings a point of value in the way of ceremony and the connection of this place being the red kangaroo dreaming. But when I look at knowledge and when I look at history and this collection, and I suppose when I look at Aboriginal people, we saw purpose in everything that we needed. Not what we wanted, but what we needed. And so therefore we only took what we needed, and therefore we used everything, or we shared everything. And so therefore it had a life, it had a journey. And when I look at those journeys, and, you know, myself, as I have collected stories, as I've collected knowledge of the landscapes that we come to, collected history of our people beyond the colonial connection. And when I look at all of those things, I think sometimes, what is the purpose? What are we really setting out to achieve with that? Because we put many things behind glass cabinets. And oddly enough, I've been doing some work with the Dresden museum, and they have many of the Ghana artefacts because there's not many Ghana artefacts. And we have said to them, look, we'll make you new ones to replace those old ones so that we can get them to be returned to us. But therefore, by giving you new ones, they're made by the Ghana people, but you're able to then take them from underneath the glass cabinet and put your hands on them, touch them and work with them. Just as I am currently working with the Yankalilla Museum down there, they are putting a Ghana display down there, and I have given them my personal items so that, and if you go there, you can actually touch those items. You can pick them up, you can see them and feel them and know what they're all about. And I think that's really important because that's how we gain knowledge and that's how we become valued for that. But I want to leave with a story I think that really emphasises the importance and value, because I know the Aranda people, they saw that their knowledge would be lost, and so they took advantage of the anthropologists by allowing them to film their ceremonies, to record their ceremonies, because we were obviously an oral visual people, and so they knew that it would be lost otherwise. But when I talk of this story, a story about how this one elder wanted to take all of the knowledge and wisdom in the world. They collected it, they gathered it, they put it into a big bag just like the one I have. They wanted to hide it from everyone. They found the tallest tree, they climbed that tree. As they got to the top of that tree, it was getting harder because the weight of the bag was so heavy with all the knowledge. The size of the bag was so large that he could not get his arms completely around that tree. And as he was getting closer to the top, a young person walked by and called out, great elder, what are you doing? And the great elder called back, none of your business, on your way, young person. But I can see you're in trouble, I want to help you, said the young person. And he said again, on your way. And then the great elder fell, and as he fell to the ground, all of that knowledge that he had collected in that bag once again fell across the nation. Therefore, you and I, we have that opportunity to know this knowledge, to collect this knowledge, to share, to pass on this knowledge, to understand this knowledge, and therefore understand that no one person owns it, is shared. So what did this young person have to say to this great elder that was of any value, considering the great elder had all of the knowledge and wisdom in the world? And the great elder said to the young person, what were you going to say? He said, well, I can see that the bag was heavy. I could see that it was getting in your way and you couldn't get your arms around the tree. All I wanted to tell you is if you put that bag to your back, you would then be able to get your arms around the tree. He said, how did you know this? And he said, 2 words, common sense. So in life, we must use the knowledge to understand that there is a value of using it in a way that isn't selfish, that is shared, that it is given and passed to those who come after us, in some ways before us. And so I hope you see that the things that you collect are not behind glass, are not kept in a way that is not shared, that is not continued, and that it has life, and it is given life, and that it has life. So, nachu yakandaya, padnia do. Let us continue to walk, not alone, but together, and realise that cultures enable us to come together and never say goodbye, always say see you later, because these words are of great value, because the things that we leave with people enable us to carry our spirit, our connections beyond our physical and into our spiritual. So, nakara, nechaya. Thank you.
Natalia, Mickey. I'd also like to acknowledge that we meet tonight on the lands of the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to thank Mickey for those really insightful words. He's always so generous in and patient in sharing his knowledge. And I do want to, at the History Trust, we really feel that collective responsibility to work together, to walk together, and to share and carry that knowledge together. So thank you, Uncle Mickey. Those words were fabulous. I'd like to acknowledge some distinguished guests here tonight. We have Greg Mackey, OAM, CEO of the History Trust of South Australia. And obviously we have Mickey, but you've just heard from him. We have some of our South Australian history guardians in the crowd tonight. We have colleagues from the History Council of South Australia. Of course, we have our partners in the University of South Australia. How many times can I say South Australia? And our media partners, Channel 44, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's Talking History, Collecting Passions and Pitfalls. So it is my pleasure to introduce tonight. This is our second in-person Talking History for 2023. And this year it is a partnership with the University of South Australia. It's a collaboration, a true collaboration, and we're really delighted to be working with UniSA and the teams here to kind of bring South Australian history to diverse audiences, to really showcase the stories, the research, the collections, and diversify that audience, because we all know history is awesome, right? But there are so many amazing stories out there and so many people that don't know them. So we're partnering to try and spread those South Australian stories far and wide. I had a wrestle with my printer this afternoon and it's printed things very strangely. I'd also like to acknowledge, as I said before, our Channel 44 media partners who are broadcasting this series. So again, just a reminder, we are being filmed tonight. And this will be available, as with the whole Talking History series, on their streaming service very shortly. And I do just want to take so we're very, very proud to be working with Channel 44 across a number of our events, and I just want to take the opportunity to recognise how important that free-to-air community TV is today. So we're happy to be working with Channel 44. So tonight, you're in for a real treat. We're going to hear from this panel of historians, curators, academics about the why, the how, and the what of what we collect. So right now, I'm just going to hand over to my very valued colleague and our inaugural state history advocate, Dr. Kira Lindsay, who will chair tonight's proceedings. Thank you, Kira.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. How good it is to see you all here tonight. It's a bit of a wet old night, a bit of a cold old night, but it's fabulous to see familiar faces as well as some wonderful new faces. Please keep coming to Talking History. Our next one will be in September, and then we've got another one in October. So stay tuned and give us some feedback on what you think about this new look Talking History. You can see we've gone all out with the colours, and we really want to create a sense of dialogue. One of the things we want to do is hear from you as well. So we're not just talking history or talking histories. In fact, we're also listening. So there'll be quite an opportunity to open up the floor for discussion at the end of the presentation today. And, you know, I'm tempted to have a little bit of an icebreaker as a way to start it. So as Christy said, and of course, as ever, I'd like to just pause for a moment and thank Uncle Mickey. I'm always going to be thinking about you when I stick my bag at the back now. Common sense. I love that. Just the simplicity of it, and the idea that knowledge is not to be held. It's not about power. It's about empowering. So thank you for that. Oh, I'm going to put on my glasses because I'm getting old. I have a few random notes. What do we collect? How do we collect? Why do we collect? What do we do with it, and when should we give it back? What are the joys, the passions, the pitfalls, and what do we do, and how are we coming to terms with some of the more sinister legacies of collecting in the Australian context? Tonight, in fact, the word collecting has a 15th century Latin etymology, and it means to gather together. That sounds pretty straightforward, right? And it's kind of what we're doing tonight. So we could kind of think of ourselves as a transitory collection of some sort. And how would we describe ourselves? Perhaps an anxiety of academics, a hilarity of historians, a curiosity of collectors. I'll leave that with you. I guess I want to say that one of my personal passions of collecting are words. I've always loved words. I'm a word person. And some of my favourite words are collective nouns. For example, a crush of rhinoceroses. I'm just giving you some ideas in case you should like to go down this avenue. A skulk of foxes. Of course, the murder of crows, but also a parliament of owls. And best of all, a pandemonium of parrots. So we might think about how we would describe ourselves as a collecting group, not only here tonight, but as collectors more generally, people who care about the things that are in our trust, people who have things that are held in our trust, or that trust others with the things that matter to us. We kind of do all of those things at the same time. When I think about collecting as well, I think about what it means for me personally. I think about the people in my life who have collected and how that shaped my life, my being, my sense of the world. My father with his books and his bottles, my mother with her box of dress-up clothes that came from her grandmother, and all those recipes stuffed into a giant drawer. I think about my sister who collected abandoned animals and deranged vegetables that didn't look quite right, all dried and sort of mangulated and strange on the windowsill. My brothers who collected swords and flies, and me with a great big box of toys that my parents tried to make me give up when I was 8. And so, of course, being the child political activist that I was, I created a picket with them all standing beside me. Yes, I guess even then I had a passion for collecting. So in that spirit of disclosure, I want to invite you to think for yourself about them for a moment, about the things in collecting that have mattered to you. Collections that have shaped you, either from your childhood that you're involved in now, and to turn to somebody sitting next to you and just to share a collection that really matters to you. So this is an icebreaker, but it's also so that when we get to that conversation at the end of the evening, you'll have some ideas circling around in your thoughts. So come on, have a think. What are the collections that matter to you? Tick, tick, tick. All right, I can feel a lot of joy and interest starting to circulate through the room. But perhaps just before we start, I might throw it over to you just to tell me how talking about collections made you feel just then. Just anyone want to throw out a few words of, how that felt, or anything that kind of came to you just at the top of your head about what it feels like to talk about collections that mattered to you? You don't... Warmth! Yes, at the back. Insightful. Interesting. Nostalgic. There's that powerful word. Interesting word, nostalgia. It's a constructed word, right? And it's got such a rich etymology. And somewhere in there are some quite uncomfortable yearning feelings as well. And I wonder if that's part of a collection experience as well, something that to do with our mortality that we might be wrestling with as well. Anybody else? Validated. Who said that? Oh, over there. Why so? Yeah. All right. Well, honey, you've come to the right place. And Anthea, is that excitement? A howder. A howder of historians, or a how-to of historians. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, this is just to kind of warm the fires, the cockles of your hearts, and to get you thinking about it. Now we'll turn to the experts so that they can give us more fuel in our fire, more juice, and they can validate you hopefully a little bit more. Tonight we have the great honour, it's my great honour in fact, to introduce you to 3 different speakers, and we're going to start with my old my old work chum and friend, Dr. Jared Thomas. Jared is a Ngakanu person from the southern Flinders Ranges, and he's also the research fellow of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander material, culture and art at the South Australian Museum and the University of South Australia. Jared is highly regarded author of critically acclaimed books for children and young adults. And tonight he's going to discuss the South Australian collection management processes and aspirations in response to his 2022 Churchill Fellowship, which investigated colonised peoples' interpretive strategies in Finland, in Norway, in Canada, New Zealand, and the US. Over to you, Jared. Thank you.
Okay, great to be with you all on Kaurna country tonight. Thank you very much, Uncle Mickey. You know, I have complaints about how much public speaking I've been doing recently, but the great thing about it is I get to see you weekly, so thank you very much. I'm going to be speaking, so my role is the William and Margaret Geary Research Fellow of Aboriginal Material, Culture and Visual Art at the South Australian Museum. As Kira said, I'm a Nukuna person from the southern Flinders Ranges. My ancestry is actually Nukuna and Nadri from the mid-north, and my mother's Aboriginal family is from Winton, Queensland. But probably what is most apparent to you is my Viking ancestry. And I might talk about that a little bit in the context of this discussion. When I'm talking about an Aboriginal perspective about collecting, really it's my perspective. But I will be adding, I guess, the perspectives that are expressed to me by other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about collections and the practices, which are so incredibly varied. And my viewpoints around collections and how they're managed has changed significantly. And I know that they will continue to over the next year or two. And especially during my Churchill last year, they were very challenged, and I'm going to talk about some of that challenging. I'm going to be talking about the modes of representation and collection through South Australian, the history of the South Australian Museum, and I'm going to just point out a model of my aspirations or visions for how Aboriginal material should be collected, managed and interpreted. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 modes of collection, but in fact I think there's 4 modes that have existed through the museum. So the South Australian Museum's collection of Aboriginal material culture, archives and archaeology are the most significant in the world and the most representative, with over 30,000 objects and millions of archival and archaeological objects. But they haven't always served us as Aboriginal people. In fact, they've been used to actively disenfranchise us as Aboriginal people. So they've been used to tell a story about us that doesn't actually exist. So if we look at the first phase of that representation, so from the late 1800s through to the 1920s, the emphasis was on physical anthropology. And it was during Edward Charles Sterling, his reign as the director of the South Australian Museum. And he was also the first professor of physiology, so a huge emphasis on anatomy. So physical anthropology, it was contributing to the construction of race. It was studying humans through an evolutionary and biological perspective. The South Australian Museum possesses thousands of Aboriginal human remains, including 20 of my own family members. So during this time, that construction of race, of course, today we know that contemporary science tells us that everyone here in the room, we're all of the same race. We're descended by someone dubbed as mitochondrial Eve. At some stage, our common ancestor was black. And our whiteness, or those of us that have fair skin, is from a genetic mutation, from exposure, needing vitamin D when we moved to colder climates. So at one stage we're all black, we were all the same race. But the collection was used to show Aboriginal people as being inferior, subhuman, different. When I look at the labels, it even refers to people as subhuman. So a pretty nasty time. And in terms of the interpretation, it was very taxonomical. It was in types. And there was another myth that was constructed, and that was that Aboriginal people are nomadic, which we are not. And artefacts were interpreted as weapons, which they seldom are. They are tools, and tools that put food in people's mouths. So we were constructed through this representation to be deemed as savage, uncivilized, people that needed civilization, and a legitimised colonisation. So the objects we used are not the best way for us. Move to the 1920s, there's a shift towards cultural anthropology with a bit of a physical anthropology hangover. So Tyndale, during that his tenure, was still trying to construct Aboriginal people as being various races of people that came to the Australian continent at different points in time. So there was more of a focus on a people's material culture in combination with behavioural patterns, religious practices, social structures, traditions, and more to gain an insight into who we are as people and cultures within the continent. What do the exhibitions look like? They shift a bit. There's still sacred objects on display, but Tyndale starts to shift that, and in the 1950s sets up the first sacred collection. So he's more sensitive to the desires and observations of Aboriginal people. There's a bit of contention around this, but there was either 400 Aboriginal human remains on display up until 1983, or there were 4. We're still doing the research to work that out. But it appears on the list there were actually 400 in the Stirling Gallery. So even if we think about 4 Aboriginal human remains on display on North Terrace in 1983. Then we move through to the creation of the Aboriginal Cultures Gallery. It's an emphasis on cultural anthropology where there is more of an effort to show regional distinction. And yeah, we can see this through the present AACG, but it's still very taxonomical and we do not get context. So Uncle Mickey talked about the lack of Ghana material culture within the space. That is of concern, but what is really of concern to me is that people can't go into the space and hear the beautiful stories of people like Uncle Mickey and get that real insight into what this material culture, the collections actually mean. Then the fourth mode of representation is one whereby the museum at the moment is leading the facilitation of First Nations people to lead representations of ourselves through temporary exhibitions, and we are developing interventions within the permanent displays of the museum. And of course, the South Australian Museum has really shifted in its efforts, and thank you to the State Government of South Australia for supporting the human remains repatriation, which is occurring. Okay, so this is a photograph taken just the other day where my great colleague, Alice Bill, who's a collection manager who's in the audience, placed some of the Nukuna objects held by the South Australian Museum. And my uncle, so we've got Uncle Lindsay Thomas and Ronald Boland, who were there to negotiate or navigate our repatriation of human remains process. But, going into the collections and looking at our material culture. So our connection to collections are very complex. With our human remains repatriation, that's very clear cut. Where there's our ancestors in the museums, they need to be returned to country. When it comes to collection, when material culture, it's not so clear cut. So in relation to these objects that were commissioned, acquired in the 1920s and 1940s, produced by my forefathers, there's receipts for the purchase of our objects during this period. They aren't objects of conquest, although the power relations still need to be questioned. So what was the role of the church in the Southern Flinders, Baroota, where the objects were taken from, even though they were purchased or commissioned. With our objects, we don't have the adequate facilities to preserve them. The South Australian Museum possesses a 10,000-year-old boomerang. Incredible. It's one of the oldest wooden objects on the planet. So to return that to country, do we have the right facility to ensure its survival for another 10,000 years? Many of us like our objects to be amongst the other 30,000 that are in the collection. And we would like the objects to be used to tell our story. So in terms of the Nukuna objects, how can they be used to tell who we are? The sophistication of our cultures and who we are as people. So during my Churchill Fellowship, travelling across the world and looking at all these examples of museums and galleries and how First Nations people are interpreting, managing our own collections, I was really fortunate to engage with the Sami. And the Sami are quite remarkable. I mean, of course, we're having this conversation about the voice at the moment, but in Finland and Norway, as recommended by the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the government provides a percentage of the GDP to their Indigenous peoples for the Sami to have self-determination, which means the Sami don't just have a voice, they have their own parliament. And they get to determine how they expend that money on health, education, self-cultural representation through museums. And of course, they invest a lot into their own culture. So they have a very different relationship to, so this is Paula Rahola, who's the collections manager at the Karajok Museum, Sami Museum in Karajok. And Paula and other Sami were telling me, so here she's carrying a cradle made of bearskin. And she was telling me that with Sami, they think of repatriation very differently to what we do. They see it as objects being returned to the museums that they own and manage. And therefore, they look at the museum, their collection, their archives, as being an elder. And not in lieu of elders, but in addition to the elders that are in their community. So through their control of the collection, there's greater trust by the community. That ownership is really integral. So First Nations led management, ownership of spaces. And really for Australian museums and collections to move away from being houses of horror, which sometimes they are for people, to being places of safety, and to address power inequity, that's where we need to move to. A model that is like the Sami. I think I'm gonna hold it there, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more to discuss during our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jared. I felt like you only just got started. Great. There's so much that we stand to learn from that experience that you had during the Churchill. And I'm glad that you're out there doing as many public talks as you are with Uncle Mickey for that purpose. So the next speaker who's going to talk to us tonight is Mandy Paul. Mandy is a colleague of mine. She's the head of collections at the History Trust, and she's responsible for the management and development of the State History Collection. That's why she's here. Well, one of many reasons. Understanding and sharing complex and contested histories has been a thread running through Mandy's career, informing her work for over 3 decades as a social history curator, a museum director, a collections manager, and as a consultant historian on native title claims in jurisdictions across Australia. Mandy holds postgraduate qualifications in history and museum studies and has published widely on Australian social history, on museology and the intersections of history and law in native title. She is currently a partner investigator on 2 ARC projects and is also a visiting fellow in the School of Humanities at the University of Adelaide and a member of Flinders University College of Humanities Advisory Board. So, over to you, Mandy. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Christy. Much appreciated. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on Kaurna Yurta, Kaurna country, and to say, Natalia, thank you, Uncle Mickey, although he's not here, but that's okay. I feel really privileged to live and work on this beautiful unceded country, and I pay my respects to its custodians. And thank you, Jared. It was really a really interesting teaser, and I can't wait to discuss these more this evening and later. And I'm afraid I've also got a content warning this evening. My presentation includes some hate symbols. So the Haken Cross or right-facing swastika. So I'll just put that out there before we begin. So collecting is one of the History Trust's legislated functions, and that doesn't make it sound very exciting, I know, but actually it really is. The State History Collection comprises about 45,000 objects that are significant to South Australia's history, and that's what they have in common. Their significance and the fact that we look after them on your behalf. Apart from that, they're incredibly varied, and I'm going to introduce you to the collection itself, as well as some of the objects within it, their relationships, and a bit about them, a bit about their stories. So prepare for some delight, some discomfort, a bit of nostalgia, we've already talked about nostalgia, and maybe a hint of outrage. But the State History Collection is only one of the state's collections and should be seen in the context of the other cultural collections. That is the State Library Collection, the South Australian Museum Collection that we've already talked about, the collection of the Art Gallery of South Australia, and the State Library. So there are other state collections too, including state records, the herbarium at the Botanic Gardens, and even the core sample library at Tonsley. And if anyone gets an opportunity to go and look at that, let me recommend it, especially if you're a storage nerd. Technically, the zoo is also a collecting institution. But back to the state's cultural collections. I like to think of them collectively as the state collection. And this captures the usually cooperative relationships across the institutions when it comes to collecting. And it's a good reminder that the way these collections are organised reflect the history of those institutions, which in turn reflects particular ways of seeing, as Jared has already hinted, one that would seem very logical to colonists in 19th century Adelaide. History as a collecting area is more recent and made its way into the museum world as a discipline from the 1970s onwards. In most other states, the State Museum has a history division, and it's a bit of an accident of history, sorry, I couldn't resist that, that here instead, the History Trust was created in 1981. And there's an interesting demarcation that's existed from 1981 between the collecting remit of the History Trust and the SA Museum as it relates to what we might think of as Aboriginal history or what we might think of as our shared history. So let's talk about that a bit too, possibly. It's something we're trying to get beyond. And if we think of the state cultural collections as part of a distributed state collection, we can also add into our thinking the other collections that hold that have objects of state significance. For example, some of the over 300 community museums and historical societies across the state. So we need to think about all those contexts. So the State History Collection, we have big things. This is Steam Loco 523, which is one of our collection of rolling stock. And they're all on loan to the National Railway Museum in Port Adelaide for pretty obvious reasons. 523 is a 520 class steam loco built at the South Australian Rail's Islington Workshops, which entered service in 1944. And it was named Essington Lewis after the then general manager of BHP. And we've got small things. This model blacksmith shop, including working miniature tools, was made by Adelaide gunsmith Alfred Evans. He served as an armourer at Keswick Barracks during the First World War, and following the war, he displayed this model at the All Australian Peace exhibition, which was run by the South Australian Chamber of Commerce at Jubilee Exhibition Building on North Terrace, as it was, in May 1920. We've also got things that are old, new, borrowed and blue. So this is one of the old ones by our standards. Nothing compared to 10,000 years, I have to say. So this commemorative cup was made to commemorate the coronation of King William IV and Queen Adelaide in 1831, predating the colony and the capital that bears the Queen Consort's name. It was presented to the Art Gallery of South Australia by Queen Mary as part of empire-wide celebrations for the Silver Jubilee of George V in 1935. And this cup was transferred to the History Trust of South Australia in 1984 as part of what we call the Historical Relics Collection. I'll just say that again, the Historical Relics Collection. So this collection is a capsule collection of colonial history. We'll return to that in a little bit. We've got new things. This COVID beanie, mask and stress ball were made by Susie McKenna in 2020 and collected as part of the History in the Making contemporary collecting project we undertook at the height of the pandemic. McKenna, whose son and grandchildren were in Sweden, unwell but unable to test whether or not it was COVID, she decided to knit and crochet representations of the virus as a form of stress relief. And we've got borrowed things, borrowed from us, that is, on outward loan. This is Frenchman's Rock. You might be surprised to know that this piece of sandstone, engraved by members of Baudin's exhibition in 1802, is part of the State History Collection. It's currently on loan to KI Council, and we're working with our colleagues at the National Trust and hope it'll soon be on display at the Penneshaw Maritime and Folk Museum. And we've got blue things. This ceramic boat by South Australian artist Jerry Wedd was inspired by Iranian ceramic tradition depicting moon-faced women, in inverted commas, and the media coverage of the Children Overboard affair in 2001. The object was originally loaned to the Migration Museum for an exhibition called Refugees in Australia, 1972 to 2012. Not the best exhibition title we've ever had. And then it was later donated. Wedd's work often mixes familiar patterns such as the blue and white willow pattern and images with political messages to create a subversive form of protest. Some of the stories we can tell with our collection, or your collection, are about individuals, and those individual stories can also be told in the context of wider events and social change. This is a page from Felix Berger's book of sketches of Shanghai. Berger was a Jewish artist and political refugee from Vienna who, after an unsuccessful attempt to secure asylum in England in 1938, was returned to Germany. During the summer of 1939, he obtained a passage to Shanghai where he lived in poverty, surviving by selling his artwork. He migrated to Australia in 1949, settled in North Adelaide and earned a living as a mail officer. His parents and brother were killed in concentration camps. This is a story about a person, an individual, but it's also a story about the Holocaust. Known as Roma I, Dame Roma Mitchell was the first Australian woman to be Queen's Counsel, Supreme Court Judge, Acting Chief Justice, Deputy University Chancellor and State Governor, although not simultaneously. It's something to aim for. Again, we can tell Dame Roma's story as one about an individual trailblazer, or we can tell her story as being about the changing status of women in South Australia and Australia. And we can also look again at our objects in our collection to reinterpret well-worn stories. So on the right we have William Keckwick's pannikin. I sort of meant to actually have his quart pot up there, but we'll just have to make do with the pannikin because we've got Keckwick's, both those things from Keckwick. So Keckwick was second in command on John McDouall Stuart final successful expedition across the continent from north to south in 1862. This object came into the History Trust as part of that historical relics collection. Working with First Nations former colleague Jacinta Coolmartree on the Overland Telegraph Line project, which was a joint project with the State Library, SA Museum and the Australian Catholic University, and on which Jared was also a member of the team on that project, provided a new way of thinking about this object. Locating water for his horses and party was really critical for Stuart on his expeditions, and he sought information from Aboriginal people he encountered about its whereabouts. And then, on more than one occasion, he blithely emptied a local well using the quart pot, careless of the impact it might have had on the people whose land him and his party were traversing. If you want to know more about different ways, new ways to look at colonial objects, have a look at the Overland Telegraph Line project website. So it's the same object, but we're looking at it from a different perspective, and it really enriches the stories that we can tell. And we can also put our collection objects in relation to each other to tell narratives that might help us understand connections or changes over time. One example, and not a comfortable one, is internment or detention or incarceration. This club is one of the many confiscated from German and Italian internees at the Loveday internment camp near Barmera in the South Australian Riverland. Loveday was the largest internment camp built by the Commonwealth Government during the Second World War. This club is carved with a Hakenkreuz, or right-facing swastika, a symbol of fascism. And it was one of the objects I had in mind when, along with Board Chair Liz Ho, I gave evidence earlier this year to the Legislative Council Select Committee on the proposed legislation to ban the display of neo-Nazi and Nazi symbols. The History Trust supports this legislation. We put the case for an exemption for cultural institutions, including museums, as it's important that we're able to use the collection to tell the history of fascism in South Australia, carefully and in context. And this debate is a reminder of the importance of the past in the present and of the power of symbols. This is one of two carvings donated by Kayvan Abak, a Mandaean refugee from Iran who arrived in Australia as an unaccompanied minor in late 2000. He made the carvings while he was being held in Woomera Detention Centre, and he made them using pieces of limestone he found lying around and razor wire. He imagined the rose as a gift for his grandmother, who remained in Iran. And this placard was collected at the Black Lives Matter rally on the 6th of June 2020 in Adelaide. It reminds us of the long history of activism against black deaths in custody in Australia and makes the connection explicitly with global events following the killing of George Floyd in the United States. I thought I'd also share with you a very different series of objects. One, it's a collection that doesn't get out often, and it relates to South Australian businesses. This is a recent acquisition. It came into our collection as a result of globalisation. Japanese beverage giant Asahi, thank you, Glenn. Asahi purchased Schweppes, which had earlier purchased Woodruff's. So now we can tell the story of the other end of that process, the company that started in Norwood. We also have a wonderful collection of domestic technology made by Simpson and Son, a company that started when Alfred Simpson, who'd arrived in South Australia with his family in 1849, established himself as a tinsmith in Topham Street in 1853. By the 1890s, Simpsons had the largest metal manufacturing plant in Australia. And this looks like a brick. Oops. Did we miss my brick? We did. Oh. Might be next. Nope. Oh, there we go. So we've missed the Hallett mini brick. You'll just have to leave that. We might post it on social media. Gladys Simchoon. We have a fabulous collection relating to Gladys Simchoon, her family, and their businesses that were a feature of Adelaide's East End from the 1920s to the 1980s. John Simchoon, Gladys's father, was among a very small number of Chinese migrants in Adelaide in the 1890s, and he managed to bring his wife, So Young Moon, to South Australia in 1899, just before the introduction of the White Australia policy. The Zeta runabout was manufactured by South Australian company Lightburn. In 1963, this South Australian white goods manufacturing company decided to diversify their business into car production. We've also got one of their washing machines in the collection, and it's notable, it's kind of the same shape. Oh, there's the brick. So this looks like a brick, I know, but it's not. It's actually an eraser. It's a promo for local brickmaker Hallett's and Sons. Hallett started in the pug holes of Adelaide's western suburbs in the 1880s and remained an important South Australian company until it was absorbed by New Brick in the 1960s. This jigsaw is a souvenir from the Gulf Trip cruises that were run by Adelaide's Steamship Company. The Gulf Trip was South Australia's affordable version of the modern cruise ship holiday, a favourite for honeymooners, and a shout out to someone in this room who put this jigsaw back together recently. Not that one? Sorry, Gabby. And lastly, I couldn't resist concluding with something topical. This T-shirt was collected at the community launch of the Yes campaign in Adelaide in February this year. We will, of course, also be collecting objects from the No campaign. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mandy. I knew it would be great to have you there, and just so terrific to be taken on that tour through the collection. I know you know a lot more than that, but you chose some wonderful things to share with us, and I could feel the atmosphere in the room was one of great pleasure to have all those different parts of South Australian stories being told. So thank you very, very much. Our third and last speaker for this evening is Corinne Ball. I spent so much time trying to get Corinne right. Corinne. There's a long story behind this. It's got something to do with the book that I've just written. Anyway, we won't go there. But Corinne Ball. I'm sorry, Corinne. Corinne's going to talk to us about Beth Catford collection. But first I want to tell you a little bit about Corinne. Corinne assists with the management of the State History Collection. She has a particular interest in social and women's history, yay, and enjoys working on everything, on research projects. She's curated over a dozen museum exhibitions as the lead curator and the co-creator. She's written numerous short articles for Adelaideia, for the Essay History Hub and in the Daily, and she's blogged on various platforms including Medium, and she has 3 upcoming book chapters in academic museology and history titles. She's also presented at state, national and international conferences about South Australian history, the destitute asylum and disability history. And tonight she's going to talk to us about a collection that I've been really fascinated with. It's the Beth Catford collection. So I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Hello, and I do apologise in advance for coughing. I have recently had the spicy cough, but I am not contagious, I promise. It's not a great combination with asthma, which I also have. So, I'm going to tell you all about the lovely Beth Catford and her passion for fashion. This is a picture of Beth in her later years. It's a wide-ranging collection, and it all comes because of actually this lady and her aunt. So if I had to sum Beth Catford up in 10 words, I would say countrywoman, passionate collector, knowledgeable, generous, expert needlewoman, self-taught, and she was also a farmer's wife. So she is a woman of many parts, as of course we all are, and she began to collect, and it kind of got a bit out of hand, but in a really good way. So Beth's collection started in 1971 and continued until the early 2000s. It includes about 3,000 items, mostly donated or sourced from families, and particularly from women in South Australia's mid-north. Set me off now. She was based in Orroroo, and that is the primary resource area for her, but also the broader Flinders Ranges, Adelaide and suburbs, some regional towns, and a few interstate items. So Orroroo has about 1,000, 1,100 items, Flinders Ranges 360, Adelaide 900, and it just goes from there. She also purchased quite a bit at auctions and op shops, and it's all great fun. So she had her own private costume museum in the end, because what else do you do when you've got 3,000 items? And that was the Yesteryear Costume Gallery, which ran in Orroroo until 2008. So it all started actually because of her aunt, Therese Innes. So Therese was Beth's aunt, and she had a fashion collection of a couple of hundred items, which she had been given by family and friends. And during the Second World War, she did fashion shows and put on displays and parades to support Red Cross, as many people did. And Beth kind of took this over. She would do similar things later. In a departure from curatorial best practice, she and Therese and others often wore the garments at the parades. It's like, we're not thinking about that, we're not thinking about that. We don't do that. But, you know, different standards. It wasn't a museum until later. So these are some of the items that were the building blocks of the collection that she got from Therese. So the two items on the left and in the middle are Innes family items. A lovely dark green dress, which I think is about 1870, and a fabulous set of bathers. I just love that set, it's completely gorgeous. And then a real favourite on the right, which is, and I'll describe it as we have it in our catalogue, pink and green princess line tea gown or wrapper with a lily Henry II collar in green silk. Now this belonged to Annie Bowman of Martindale Hall, who I think lots of people will know who that is. So many people who donated or were the source of things were the great and good, but also very mundane, quotidian, we could even say. It really is an extremely diverse collection that reflects lifestyles, ages, areas, regions, tastes. Some of it's very luxurious, some of it's homemade, some of it's very not well made. There's something for everybody. So it includes vintage threads and fashionable velvets. On the left is a English gown from the 1840s, donated by the Elwood family. So you can imagine Dickensian heroines kind of wandering around in something like that. In the middle is a set of bathers from the Fogden family. They were a serial donor, various members of the Fogden family. Over 100 items in the collection come from the Fogdens. And on the right, one of my favourites, the picture doesn't really do it justice. It's actually a deep burgundy velvet. It's just thick and gorgeous and 1970s. It's actually a bridesmaid's outfit. So there's a dress that went underneath the coat, and you have your little pink fur muff. Winter wedding, obviously. It's just gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. So you can see there's a huge range of textiles and textures and fabrics and techniques. sources. The gown on the left comes from England. The bridesmaid's outfit was made in South Australia. It is a global collection, quite literally. So, representing ages and stages, births, deaths, and marriages, and beyond. So, in the collection, there are hundreds of items reflecting various ages and stages of life. Children's clothes are represented, although not much after babyhood, as is quite common with social history collections. We've got a lot of whiteware, a lot of baby clothes, but not a lot from, kind of 4 to 15, and then lots of women adult clothing. On the left is a lavender gown. You can't see, obviously, but inside it's been adjusted to accommodate a pregnancy. That comes from the Inglis family of South Australia. The red one is a maternity gown from 1990, designed by Monica Monkhouse. So you've got bang up to the minute Australian designers versus homemade, more privately sourced items. The little inset at the bottom is part of a wedding shawl from 1844, again from the Inglis family, so that was brought over to South Australia as a family treasure. We have a mourning brooch, a jet mourning brooch, and there's quite a lot of stuff about death and mourning in Beth's collection, because a large focus of the collection is 19th century, and of course the Victorians had their very own interesting ways of death. And we maybe talk about collecting some of that stuff later. And then on the right is a very gorgeous 1943. It's actually a bridesmaid's dress from the Hughes family, and it's just divine. You can just imagine, some Hollywood starlet kind of floating around, and completely lovely. So, a family affair. These items are actually from the Catford and Innes families. And they're a bit bittersweet. So on the left is Beth's own wedding gown, which is completely gorgeous, and I think she did make it herself. In the middle is part of her daughter Heather's layette, and Heather very sadly died at only a few days old. So that's a very poignant item that we have in the collection, and Beth chose to put Heather's whole layette in the collection. So there's all sorts of interesting things to think about memory and keeping those kind of painful memories kind of front and centre, but not front and centre. And again, that's maybe something we can talk about later. And then the lovely item on the right is from Torres Innes' trousseau. So that's bridal linen luxury lace. Very gorgeous. I'm going too fast, but we'll have lots of time for questions. So it's not just costume. There are all sorts of really quite random things. And this part of the collection, the accessories collection and auxiliary extras, was one of the last things we were to catalogue. And so every box was just a joy to open of quite random things, and quite lovely things too. So ranging from royal paraphernalia, Beth was quite the royalist, and there was things like a little bell from Charles and Di's wedding, just all sorts of gorgeous stuff. We have a religious memento brooch in the top middle, Salvation Army badge, gorgeous 1920s beaded handbag, a fabulous parasol, and a lucky rabbit's foot, which was a bit vegetarian, not really keen on that sort of thing. It was a bit traumatising. So, a real highlight of the collection is this gorgeous outfit that was worn by Jessie McPherson Smith, who is the mother of Ross and Keith Smith. And I was looking back through some of the paperwork, and there was an interview done with Torres Innes' husband Archibald in the 2000s, and he said that Mrs. Smith phoned up Torres and said she had some things to give, and they went over there and picked them up. And then Torres used to like wearing this as part of the Red Cross parades, and also Beth wore it too. It is completely lovely. It was recently on display in the State Library a couple of years ago. So it is an entire ensemble, and it dates from around 1900. Jessie Smith Nay McPherson was born in Western Australia, died in 1947. It comprises a bodice and skirt, which is cream wool silk challis or chalice, I don't know how you say it, a high neck bodice with hook and eye closures, leg and mutton sleeves, floral lace cuffs. It's got 2 gorgeous cream leather gloves, a wire-framed hat, which is covered with a horsehair crinoline braid, an applique net, belt in matching fabric, and handbag cream silk with lace. I'm assuming everybody here is familiar with the Smith brothers. And in fact, as an aside, the lovely Lainey Anderson has just been awarded, I think, is it Historian of the Year? Emerging Historian of the Year for her work on bringing the Smith brothers display at the airport to life as part of something that History Trust was involved in. So it's a great story of South Australian interest, and so this is quite a significant costume, and it's also very gorgeous. So Beth kept really great records right up until she didn't, as you know, collection managers do. We all have little foibles. She purchased a few things as well, and these are what I call delicious mysteries. So she did buy quite a lot secondhand. I think these 3 were all bought by her in South Australia, so we can assume that they have some South Australian provenance, but what that is, unfortunately, we don't know. Each of them, though, is an absolutely gorgeous example of what they are, so it's possible that she just bought them as a type example. The one on the left, the ball gown, is, I think, in my top 3 for the collection. It is just unbelievably divine. The pictures don't do it justice. It's just the most gorgeous thing in the entire universe, I think. It's fabulous. It's so pretty. The middle one is a fabulous example of morning dress and has all this amazing jet and bead embroidery over the front. And on the right, a really, really nice, I think circa 1850 handmade gown. The stitching inside is incredible. The buttons are tiny. It's, again, incredibly complex, huge number of women hours to make it in a time before sewing machines were really widely available. Most of the lace is handmade. It's just gorge. Totally gorgeous. Love it. And some final favourites. There's quite a lot of uniform in the collection. Some railway uniform, some nurses' uniforms. This is actually a police uniform, which was donated to the Costume Gallery by the Pyatt family in 1985, worn by Mr. Robert McCallum, of Plympton Park. The middle one is actually gorgeous. It's a lovely, lovely piece of fabric that was donated by Ms. Robbins at Port Augusta. The material was purchased on board the ship Himalaya in 1960 as she came to South Australia, and Mrs. Robbins made the garment up herself. It's very, very lovely, but the inset of the belt is very nice, and you can really see the quality of her workmanship. And the last one is the thistle dress, which is, I have to say, I think that's my number 1 favourite. It's, I think, 1875, something like that. It's a very complex outfit, so the jacket comes off and then there's a blouse underneath with a little waistcoat, and there's just dozens and dozens of these Austrian glass beads down the front, and again, amazing, amazing construction. That was on display at the Maritime Museum about 5 years ago. If anybody got to see that there, it's very, very wonderful. So, how did it all come to an end? So, in 2008, Beth was getting quite elderly. So she was born in 1926, so she was in her 80s, and was looking for a home for her collection and approached the History Trust. And so a huge team of staff and volunteers went up to Orroroo and spent some considerable amount of time packing things up. I think Mandy was one of them. No? Okay. It was Amanda, wasn't it? Yes. It was a huge effort. There were literally hundreds of boxes, dozens and dozens of cubes of accessories, just an enormous quantity of things, and it was all shipped back to Adelaide, and basically has taken us about a decade to catalogue it, which we have been working through. We're pretty much finished now. It is just the most wonderful collection. It has a lot to think about it's primarily women's wear, but it's not just women's wear. It's not just South Australia, but it is primarily South Australia. It's a very wide-ranging collection. If you were talking about pitfalls, it does illustrate what happens when you really can't stop. And one of the pitfalls that I think Beth suffered from, particularly towards the end, was not being able to say no. So we can say no to things because we have a very firm collecting policy that gives us parameters to say no. It's particularly when you're offered something, your 300th wedding dress of the year, etc. And but of course, Beth didn't operate under that parameter, and she was friends with lots of the people who donated. So I think she did, particularly at the end, find it quite hard to say no. So there's a lot of repetition, and some of it isn't of the best quality, and some of it had some very unsure provenance. But on the whole, it is a completely wonderful collection, and she was a very dedicated collection manager who gave literally thousands of hours to this amazing collection. That is a real encapsulation of what South Australian women wore, mostly. And we look forward to sharing it with you in future exhibitions, and I'd love to do a book, all sorts of stuff. So on that, I can tell you just as a final, sorry, thank you very much. Beth died in 2014 and is very much missed, and we thank her very much for the gift that she gave to South Australia. So thank you very much.
How you tell women's stories when they're not well represented or self-represented in the archives, and I think this collection is really fabulous for giving us a sense of the presence of women and women's lives.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So it's extremely evocative, and also the story of community, I think, is very strong in that collection too.
Yes, the networks that she has, obviously lots of them are locals and friends, but she has connections interstate and even overseas. I mean, there's letters in her archive where she writes to Buckingham Palace requesting information on various things. She's almost entirely self-taught. She has this huge network of people who she's consulting with and who consult her. And it's more than just one woman's obsession with clothes. It's much more than that.
Thank you very much. So I think we might open this up for a bit of a discussion between us, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I wanted to start with the question of, what do our collections tell us about us? And I thought, Mandy, we might start with you and then move over to Jared. And then inside that question, you might want to move on to this question. You don't have to, though, which is, what do we need to collect in order to tell more about ourselves? Where are the kind of gaps in there? Where are the stories that haven't been told? Take it away, Mandy.
I'm not sure if I can remember a complex double-barreled question at once. We'll see how we go. So I think I can't talk about our collections really. I can talk about the State History collection, I think, and I think it really reflects the preoccupations and the biases and the attitudes of the periods in which it was collected. So one of the interesting things, though, about history collections, and I think probably cultural collections more broadly, is that we do get the opportunity to do a bit of backfill, because in fact most of our collections are collected retrospectively. So almost all of the State History collection, for example, is collected by donation, and people are generally donating things about that relate to previous decades, and often as ideas about what's important. So as social history, for example, people begin to understand that even though their mother wasn't the mayor of Prospect, their mother something that belonged to her might have significance because of the story attached to it. There is an opportunity to do a bit of backfilling, if you like. But there is... contemporary collecting is really critical, and I guess an example that I'd mention about that is in our COVID collecting project, we collected some COVID tests. Now, I don't think COVID tests are something that would have lasted and we would have been offered in 20 years. So although there'll be other things that people offer us in the next 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years that relate back to COVID, there's some things that are hard to collect if you don't collect them contemporaneously. What should we collect is a really tricky one, and that's why, as Corinne mentioned, we have a collecting policy, because if you don't have some rigour behind what you collect, it's lost, you're lost.
It can go a bit bonkers.
Yeah. So while we're guided by the principles of our collecting, and some of them are really sort of mundane, if you like, you don't collect things that are already falling apart and can't be retrieved by the fantastic conservators at Art Lab, for example. We try and collect, our remit is South Australian history, it's pretty broad. But we try and collect things that are going to tell us something about ourselves in the future. And as a social history collection, we are interested in the story behind the object. The object, in a way, is a container for those stories. We do have a couple of type collections. We have the State Weapons Collection, for example, which is much more of a type collection than the rest of our collection. But it's really, it's a constant challenge, and it's really stimulating to think, how do we want to represent ourselves to the future, in the future? Because, we hope that our collection's going to be around for a very long time.
Thanks, Mandy. Jared, what do you think? So what do the collections that you're working with at the moment, what do they tell? You've given us a little bit of a sense there.
Such a huge question. But I guess when I look at the State's collection, it really, when you look at what is collected, what is adequately contextualised and what is adequately interpreted, and who has the power to interpret that collection, really tells you about who has power and what is privileged. And it's very clear in terms of looking at our institutions who is holding power within this state. So when you look at Aboriginal collections, and speaking about women having the right to tell stories, there's very little female interpretation or inclusion within our collections. And looking at, the wonderful textiles, etc., one of my passions is actually Aboriginal textiles and jewellery. And notions of Aboriginal beauty, so how do we express that, which hasn't been done. So when I look at the collections, really what they tell us, what they could tell us if they were adequately interpreted, 3.3% of the current Australian population has called this country home for at least 2,600 generations. And that's conservative, if we look at Aboriginal people being on the continent for 65,000 years. And, my great-grandfathers, they were 90-year-old men that had six-packs. They just, they just look like they've walked off the set of Fight Club or Rocky or something. So, if you were to interpret those collections properly, what it tells you is a group of people on this continent that weren't just surviving, we were absolutely thriving. And to look at our inventiveness, our levels of science, the wealth of our nutrition, our social organisation, our education, our spirituality. In terms of what should be collected, it's a great sadness and frustration to me that when I take elders into the collection, and these are some elders that have international recognition, and they're 70 years old and they've never been into the collection, to hold those objects that were made by their sometimes as close as grandparents. And a lot of the collectors, the provenance information was so minimal. But those elders come in, and not just elders, young people, because there has been that transmission of knowledge, and they start to provide the context.
Yep.
So for me, that's where the emphasis needs to be.
Yep.
It's collecting the information about the object and how it was used.
So recontextualising the objects so we can look at them again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, even the other day, you know, just in with my uncles and looking at as the objects were laid out, and my uncles were saying, well, it's funny how, you know, white fellas think these are weapons, right? When we have so many language groups, which indicates that there wasn't a dominant group that was trying to overtake others. It shows that there was a peaceful nation.
Yeah.
Just that in itself. The map of Aboriginal Australia is indicative of great civilization. That is the monument, right? So, yeah, just that kind of talking about these tools seldom being used because the whole modus operandi within Aboriginal Australia was diplomacy and peace.
Well, what you've brought to our attention there is so rich because you're reminding us that provenance is innately political and that we need to be really careful with the idea that the imposition of certain knowledges upon things because they are innately full of bias, prejudice, partialities, limitations.
Yeah. And I was just thinking actually with the first exercise, getting people to say, what are those things that are important to you? And I was reminded, you know, just sitting back and observing how when I was 23, I think I was in Africa, I was in Kenya and Uganda, and one of my plays about Aboriginal Australia was being performed there, and when the Africans looked, the Ugandans and Kenyans looked at my play, and they saw those representations, they always said, we need to remember if we like to eat, other people like to eat too, which is a very basic proverb. But when we look at collections and those things we're passionate about, how do we make space for others to enjoy those objects, that history, that is important to others? So for me, of course, I value my Aboriginal cultural material objects, but I love being a member of the History Trust and seeing the passion that people have for the boats and all these quirky things. Yeah. Like, I love it.
Yeah, me too. Corinne?
Oh, I was just going to say one area that we've been much more active in collecting in the last few years is disability. I was very lucky to be part of the team that were asked to go to the Julia Farr Centre as it was closing and go through their history room with their very dedicated volunteer and select items that we were going to keep in the state collection. So we took about 300 items ranging from documents, patient belongings, wheelchairs, plaques from previous buildings, things that represented the life of the organisation, but very much also the experiences of people who worked there, who lived there, who had family members who were there, the activities of residents within the organisation and within the home, but also as fundraising outside the walls of the home. It was a really amazing experience to be part of that. And we've also just taken a much smaller collection from the Crippled Children's Association, Navita. Again, for similar reasons, you know, these organisations don't have the space or capacity to care for these historic collections much longer in many cases because they're moving offices and there's lots of downsizing. So yeah, that's an area that we've been really actively collecting in recently, and it's a very what's the word? Oh yeah, sorry, Mandy, what's coming?
So the items from the Crippled Children's Association that we took in recently from Novita, who are a successor kind of organisation, includes tiaras and crowns from Miss South Australia and Mrs. South Australia, and this caused really interesting discussion in the, I'll call it the office, because I demonstrated against beauty pageants when I was young in the early 1980s, and there was a really interesting discussion about what it is that an association called the Crippled Children's Association is doing, promoting particular ideas about body form and beauty, and how it's, for us, that's a fabulous collection of items to have, because what it does is enables us to see social change right there within the last couple of decades, just like that. So that's a really good example of how fast social change can be in some ways and how achingly slow it is in others.
I want to open up a question about accessibility. Uncle Mickey talked about objects behind glass cabinets, and I've never forgotten going into Bunjalaka, the Aboriginal Cultural Centre at Melbourne Museum in the 1990s, when Gary Foley, the Aboriginal activist, was the curator there. And Gary Foley commissioned a giant statue of Baldwin Spencer, just as a big white piece of marble, and put him in the glass cabinet as if to say it's time to turn this around. And the other thing that he did was he took the provenance, the information that went along the side of objects, he removed all those and replaced them with a different form of storytelling. So it wasn't about the collector anymore, it was about the community. Now, these things have become more standard practice now, but at the time it was really quite radical. The other thing that Gary allowed was more touching. He invited tactility, sensory encounters with objects. So I wanted to open that up for discussion, but also put in the air the question of, we don't know what we don't know. For many people in the audience, I mean, tonight hearing all of you talk about what there is fills us with wonder, I think, because we didn't know it was there. So how can we find out what is there, as well as gain greater access to it? What are the problems, the challenges, and how can we do it better? Starting with you, Jared.
Okay. So, yeah, just, you're talking about Foley. I guess it's very hard for me because I have to, I guess what I was doing earlier was critiquing our collectors and critiquing what is there and my colleagues, who I have a lot of regard for. Yeah. Sorry, what was the question again, Curator? I just went off a little bit.
I was asking about accessibility.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So making collections, changing curatorial practices, perhaps,
just
but also helping people know what there is.
Also, and on that, just in regards to the idea of passion, obviously I'm passionate about the collections and how we reframe them and make them accessible, because, maybe I didn't talk about it in depth, but our collections have been used to underpin so many of those terrible policies that in regards to Aboriginal people. So stolen generations policies were really led by South Australia, and the collections were utilised to support that policy. Okay, so how do we free up the collections so that people have a different view of Aboriginal Australia? Because as they exist at present, they're framed in a way that make us look criminal, aggressive, drug takers. And I could take you into the gallery right now and show you how that plays out. So in terms of accessibility, digital media is just going to be so integral. 3D modelling, getting communities to recreate those objects that are there. So because I don't necessarily want people touching the objects made by my ancestors, they can stay behind the glass. But we will make other objects, and we'll make 3D models, and we'll have 3D images in augmented reality, etc. And that's something I'm really lucky to be leading with my University of South Australia colleagues. So we are placing those first instalments of augmented reality in the Aboriginal Cultures Gallery. So, and what that enables to do is the objects to go back to community virtually, and communities to come into the space, which is the best we can do for now.
Yeah. Thanks. So Jared's hinted at the tension between conservation and accessibility in terms of touch. We all know from our own personal experience that the more you handle things, the shorter their life is. And of course, if we're charged with keeping something in perpetuity, which is a very, very long time, we have to put our gloves on and be careful. Digitisation is the obvious answer, although you don't actually get a tactile or a 3D experience mostly. But digitisation requires a lot of resources, and it's quite, some people think it's shocking, but it's quite normal. The iceberg is normal in museums, that you only have 2 to 5% of your collection on display at any one time. But in order to provide access to the other 95, 97, 98% of your collection, we need to digitise it, and to do that we need the resources. It's not a quick or easy task.
Can I just add something to that? It's also about different forms of accessibility. So obviously you're talking in one context, the work that we're doing, or we have been doing with communities with disability broadens access for everybody. So museums are doing things like tactile tours. So if you have an artwork coming in, they do this at the art gallery, because obviously it works particularly for art, is if you've got a living artist, sometimes they will make a small swatch or a small painting or a small part of something like that vision impaired visitors can touch, and then that's often in the gallery for everybody to touch. I've seen some museums who have miniatures of large sculptures made. I've seen that outside in some museums, like in the gardens, when they've got a sculpture outside, there'll be a little mini version, sometimes with a braille plaque. It's exactly like other forms of accessibility that have broader implications than people with disabilities. So we all appreciate curb cutouts, that sort of thing. When it's accessible for one group, it's accessible for everybody. Touch tours, audio described tours, more digitisation, more 3D modelling, exactly the same sort of thing. Some of it is very high tech, others isn't very high tech. It's something that all museums could be working on. Some museums are doing a great job. We're doing our very best. Again, a lot of it comes down to funding, time, and having people who are in that conversation to start with.
Can I just one great example, if people want to go online and have a look, but the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver. So it has a wonderful storage display solution. So it's kind of semi-curated work that enables the institution to show much more than its 3% of its collection. And there's a database that people can go on from your own homes tonight and check out all of that collection. It's incredible.
Oh, fantastic, thank you. I'm going to throw it open to the floor in a moment, but I want to just quickly touch on the question of uncollecting. So policies and practices around returning or deciding that something in the collection is no longer quite appropriate, or questions of provenance lead you to question its appropriateness in the collection. Would you like to talk to that first? Yeah.
Deaccessioning is really hard, and museums hate to do it because it's scary. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Deaccessioning is really hard. Most museums don't like doing it because it's scary, but it is entirely possible with good procedures and good following of those procedures, and with buy-in throughout the organisation. A collection is a living thing. It's not a living, breathing thing, but it is a living thing. As Jared says, it reflects the biases and experiences of the collectors or of previous collectors. It's not like a curator can just come along and say, "Oh, I don't like that. We're going to get rid of that." There are policies and procedures to make sure that we don't follow fashion and fads and personal tastes when we think about moving things on. But yeah, collections are evolving things. So there's always in, there's always out, and it's not something to be scared of.
Wonderful. Mandy, do you want to answer? And we'll finish off with you, I think, Jared.
I don't think I've got much to add to what Corinne said, really, except that, so as I said at the beginning, collecting is one of the History Trust's statutory functions, and it's part of what we exist to do. Uncollecting, as you so nicely put it, is also part of what we do, but the bias is towards the collecting. Our collections continue to grow, and that's as it should be, because time continues to pass.
And yet hard too, I imagine, because you're working with limitations of space and resources, and And there's a lot of self-reflection that I would imagine has to go into, as you were saying before, reflecting on your own limitations of how you think about that. So there must be some questions that prompt you through that process?
Yeah, so we have a fabulous way of doing it. We have an acquisition committee that's made up of the collections team and the curatorial team, and we have some fantastic discussions. People have
Often some very brisk discussions.
That's one way to put it, yes. So we people have to do proposals to acquire something. A lot of research goes into those proposals. We have to compare what's being proposed to what's already in the collection. And we all know each other well enough to know people's particular biases, and we can call them out sometimes. And we know that, you know, one person's going to say, no, we do not want a ship model of the Endeavour. We can say that before it even gets to us. It's a really collegial and very robust process. It's fantastic.
Great. I wanted to dwell on it because I think one of the things about thinking about all the things that the History Trust, for example, holds in its trust for the people of South Australia is to interrogate that trust and to know what are some of the processes that are associated with how both Mandy and Corinne manage that trust, take care and responsibility. And it also raises the question of untrustworthy practices in the past, which I think leads nicely to Jared. Collections that need to be returned because they weren't taken in a trustworthy way.
Yeah, so I think when I first entered the museum, I probably thought of the museum as the trophy cabinet of colonial conquest. And so I thought I wanted to smuggle everything out. I'll just pretend I'm this, nice person with a PhD and knows lots about Aboriginal culture. But I wanted to get the objects out. And I wanted them to be returned home. But the longer I've stayed in the museum, it's a much more nuanced space. And you need to think about the agency of Aboriginal people. And there are Aboriginal people in South Australia that were making objects for the public from at least the 1880s. And there are people and communities that have wanted their collections to be both in national and international institutions. So there's a very nuanced, varied story that I'd like to tell a lot more. So when it comes to, often communities will say we want to repatriate objects. They come in and they see how much care our wonderful collection manager Alice Buell and colleagues have for the collection. Then they think about the preservation requirements, and then they go, we don't have that. Maybe can we make some more objects for you to have? Which I've found fascinating, where some really, some people have come in with that intent. We want to get everything out, and from seeing what happens within the South Australian Museum, it shifted their perspective. But we are repatriating. We're increasing our repatriation of material objects where communities have the right facilities to be able to, where they feel that they can care for them adequately. And that's, I think for me, it's about, today it's the preservation of objects is my number one, and ensuring that future generations have the ability to engage with those objects.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left, so it's your turn to ask questions. So, who's got a question? Yes, over there. If you could, when you're answering the question, because this is going to be on television, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Terry. I work at the Army Museum of South Australia. Just come back from a curator's course in Sydney. Met a lot of lovely people from across the nation. And a lot of the museums they've got, they have a lot of collections that they don't know what to do with. Like there was a gentleman who was working for the RSL, for the homeless, for the veterans, and he said there's a church there, it's just full of swords, just thrown in piles. And I said to him, well, I don't know what to do about that. What would you suggest to that gentleman?
What state are we talking about?
Sydney?
It would be good if he could contact either the Australian War Memorial in Canberra or the probably the Australian Museum or the strange recent smushing together of Sydney Living Museums and the State Archives in New South Wales. But I think I'd probably start with a war memorial.
So they don't even know what they got there, you know.
If he was in South Australia, he would be contacting our community museums department run by the wonderful Amanda. We've got guides to help people with community collections. There's lots of resources online about caring for that sort of thing, how to start cataloguing that sort of thing.
It just made me think another option would be Museums and Galleries New South Wales, which is part of this department of one of the departments in New South Wales. Can't remember what the title is.
I love a bit of problem solving. Yeah, question at the front. If you could just introduce yourself.
Małgorzata Schmidt, Norlanga. To Jared, one request and two questions. Could you please organize a curated tour of the museum? And questions. What proportions of the population of Finland and Norway are Sami people? And could you please explain to us the traditionally secret exhibitions of the First Nations and the evolution of their handling by the museum?
Okay, well, one of those things, I think I recall you coming on a curated tour with me through the Aboriginal Cultures Gallery within the last 1 to 2 years, so I do them quite regularly. And there's other staff that provide curated tour. In regards to the Sami population, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's also very small, like about 5%. So it's like, yeah, so it's not too different to the Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal population of Australia. So, but to think about that relinquishing of power by the Norwegian and Finland, Sweden people is quite remarkable. So they have relinquished power to be able to allow First Nations people to have their own representation, etc. The final question, I think, was in relation to secret sacred. Yep. So there are just subjects that are off limits that we do not want to share with other people, and they won't ever be shared with other people. That sensibilities around those objects may change, but that will be determined by the descendants of the communities from which those objects derive. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes. Thank you. If you could just remember to introduce yourself.
I'm Terry.
Again?
Too. A question for you, Jared. I'm interested. I keep reading accounts of the number of body part, bones, relics that are in the South Australian Museum. Am I right that it's about 3,000 or 4,000? And my question is, do we know where those people are from? And how long would it take to... Is there a plan to... What's the reparation plan and the time frame for that? And then further to that is, that's in South Australia, what about overseas?
Yeah, okay, so great question. And I'm not... I try to kind of remove myself from human remains repatriation. And I do that for several reasons. It's because we have staff that are specialised in that area. Secondly, I want to keep my positive relationships with Aboriginal members of the community so that they know that I'm not dealing in that space and we can focus on material culture. The provenance of many people is known. You know, there's thousands of Ngarrindjeri ancestors of people that need to be returned. In some instances, we don't know. In terms of repatriation process, it's complicated because, say, with our Nukana, there's 20 of my ancestors that are in boxes and shelves in the South Australian Museum. And I've been in a conversation about the repatriation of them for nearly 20 years, which is fine, but it's like part of the issue is a lot of Aboriginal communities don't have land to bury our old people. in a Nukana context, I remember being at a funeral of one of my uncles, great uncles, and my other great uncle said to me, "Do you know, Jared, they wouldn't let our people be buried in this graveyard because it was hallowed land, and we were deemed to be savages. So they buried us on the outside." So for some of us, when we look at with Nukana, we're ritual purists. Like, we want to do the right thing. So depending on when those people were taken, we want to rebury them according to our ritual, which isn't in a graveyard, but it's finding the right places on country, which is about accessibility. So the hold-up isn't the South Australian Museum, and it's not the community. Sometimes it's resourcing and it's about land. There's so many things, but you know, I really congratulate, I am a staff member of the museum, but I'm very critical of the museum as well. But I do congratulate the museum on their efforts with human remains repatriation. And yes, many of our old people are also held overseas, and that repatriation process is now in full effect.
I think I'd like to ask one last question of our wonderful panel each, and that is, what is one thing that the people in the room can do to participate in the process of caring for the collections that are held in your trust? So to put it back to the people in the room, how would you like to see them more active, more engaged, somehow more present, more connected to the collections?
That's a really difficult question.
Tell them to do something.
Give us money, lots of money.
Value collections in a non-material way as well. So think of the collections as yours, because they are. So we're holding, all of us who work in the state cultural institutions are holding and looking after these collections for you, so they're yours. So if you start thinking of them like that, that might help. And if you get curious about them, value them as if they're the collections that you may have at home. We, of course, professionally can't have personal collections, but you can, and you probably do. So think about the state collections as yours.
Wonderful, thanks, Mandy.
Yeah, I think, just in regards to, it's that respect for the importance of those collections to Aboriginal people. And I often, when I'm giving tours of the Cultures Gallery, I talk about there being petroglyphs 4.5 hours from here. So the Joseph pyramids are 4,900 years old. The oldest, so they're the best known, the oldest of the pyramids are 7,000 years old. The petroglyphs are 25,000 years old. They're only 4.5 hours from here. They're amongst the oldest forms of communication, human communication on the planet. Not many South Australians know about it. That is Aboriginal history, but it's our history. It's our cultural heritage as Australians. Now, if you cannot protect a 25,000-year-old petroglyph site or a 10,000-year-old boomerang, what chance do you have of protecting the church that your great-grandparents were married in? So through protecting our cultural heritage as Aboriginal people, you're beginning to shore up the protection of your own.
Thank you, Jared. Fantastic. Bravo. I'd just like you to just be, as a way of thanking our speakers tonight, I'd like you to just think for a moment about one thing that you learnt tonight, or one thing that you'll go away thinking about, something that was really interesting that you might put in the top pocket of your brain to muse over in the coming weeks. So just so that you can go home with something stirring around in your thoughts. And with that invitation from me, I'd like you to also invite you to, again, thank all of our fabulous speakers for the time and the care that they give to the collections and that they've given us tonight. Thank you. Just my final thing that I would like to say also is to let you know that the next Talking History will be here on the first Tuesday of the month in September, and it's going to be about a theme very close to my heart, South Australia's Wonder Women. So we're picking up that theme of wonder from the History Festival this year, and we're going to tell the stories of fantastic South Australian women. We've got some ideas, but if you've got an idea that you think that we need to explore, tell me about it. You can find me at the History Trust. My name is Dr. Kira Lindsay, and thank you very much again for coming tonight.
And with that, can I just ask you to thank again Cura and our panellists for this wonderful conversation and just a bit of a glimpse into the collections that tell our stories. Thank you all. Now, just very quickly, as Kira said, we are back in September for Talking History. Thank you to all of you for your continued support of the History Trust and for coming out tonight. We hope to see you again in September. As I said, this is recorded. This will be available on Channel 44's streaming services. If you are not signed up to our mailing list, if you do not follow us on our socials, jump online and please do follow us. In 2 weeks' time, we have the Gladys Elphick oration coming up. If you don't have tickets, you will absolutely want them. So again, jump online, sign up to our mailing list, follow us on socials for advance notice of all the events that are coming up. And that's it. Thank you and good night.